direction of determination. And the world knows how that eventually turned out. And one of the strong signals coming from our beloved United States of America today is that same kind of spirit is being mustered in the wake of this. Now, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani is on the telephone with us now. Mayor, thanks for being on the phone with us. Tell us what you know and what you think are the most important things for not just the people of New York, but the people of the United States to know at this hour.
Well, the first thing that I would like to say to the people of New York is to remain calm and just to try as best they can to go about their lives today. And if they're in Lower Manhattan, to evacuate it and leave so that we can get all of our rescue efforts going. We have hundreds, thousands actually, of emergency workers down in Lower Manhattan now trying to save as many lives as possible. The governor has deployed the National Guard, and they should be relieving us sometime early to late this afternoon. And we've gotten a tremendous cooperation from both the state and the federal government. From the first time that the plane hit the World Trade Center, the federal government closed down the airspace around the city, and they've been in close communication with us. And we're doing everything we can to try to save as many lives down there as possible.
Mayor Rudolph Giuliani live on the telephone with us now as you look at pictures from Lower Manhattan. Mayor, you've been quoted as saying that unquestionably the loss of life has been heavy. Any indication of how heavy that loss of life?
Dan, it's going to be some number that I almost don't even want to say. You know, I don't. It's going to be a very large number of people. I saw people jumping out of the top of the World Trade Center. I was in a building that got hit with the debris from the first tower that collapsed, and I know how many people were in the building at the time. And,
any doubt in your mind that the final death toll is bound to be in the thousands?
I really don't want to say that. It's going to be very, very large, and something that it would be very hard for us to comprehend.
Mayor,
right now,
go ahead.
Right now, the only thing we can really focus on is to try as hard as we can to keep that number down as low as possible. And I'm very worried about a lot of my police officers and firefighters, some of whom I saw go into the building, and we haven't been able to find them yet.
Mayor, what are the possibilities that many people are still trapped in the debris?
There are people that are still trapped there, and there are parts of that area we can't get into right now because of the smoke condition and the fact that some buildings are still collapsing. We just got a report that 2 other smaller buildings in that area collapsed, including one that we were possibly in. So it's still a very dangerous situation for the firefighters and police officers that are there. But they're the best. I mean, they're the best in the world. And if whatever number can be saved, they will do it.
Mayor, you've just pointed out something that we were not aware of, that because of when you have the 2 tremendous buildings, 110 stories high, both these buildings collapsed, then there are buildings around these 2 twin towers that have collapsed.
And I was in one of them, 75 Barclay Street, and when the first tower collapsed, it created a tremendous smoke condition. It hit our building. We were trapped in our building for maybe 10, 15 minutes. So there are other buildings there that are affected by this, and there's no question that there are people, many people, still trapped there that we can't save. So that's what the police department and the fire department and the emergency services people are working on furiously. And the governor has deployed, I think it's about 1,700 National Guard that will be ready to relieve our people later this afternoon.
What are the chances, Mayor, now everybody knows we're in the early stages of this, what are the chances that you're going to need help and support from outside the city, perhaps even outside the state, of fire departments, police departments, as was the case in Oklahoma City?
We have already received offers of help, and the urban search and rescue teams, I think at least 2 of them, if not 3, have been tasked by FEMA to come here. And they'll probably be here later today or tomorrow. So yes, we are going to need that help. We've already used hospitals outside the city of New York, in Westchester, in Nassau, in northern New Jersey, Rockland County, and we're working with fire personnel there to come into the city later today, tomorrow, and the next day to relieve our fire department, because this is going to be a terrible strain on them. Not only the people who are injured and hurt and worse, but rescue efforts like this really drain you. So we're going to need as much help as we can get. And we've had excellent coordination from Governor Pataki and from President Bush.
Mayor, we have reports from all over the city that hospitals in this city, and everybody knows New York has better hospitals than any other single place in the world, but that the hospitals are actually being overwhelmed.
The hospitals are absolutely overwhelmed. I was just on the phone with the director of St. Vincent's Hospital, which is the hospital that is the closest to where the attack took place. In fact, when I was rushing down there after the first plane hit, they were already deploying people, getting ready for triage, and they're overwhelmed. All the hospitals in the metropolitan area are overwhelmed, and we're getting a lot of help, as I said, from northern New Jersey, Nassau, Westchester. We'll move people there, and we are now, in order to take some of the pressure off the New York hospitals. That we are blessed with, 170 hospitals in New York City. So, in that sense, at least we have 170 that we can call on, plus a surrounding area with another 200 hospitals that we can utilize.
Mayor, as the mayor of New York City, had you received information from intelligence agencies to be on any kind of special alert or special
no
lookout?
specific information of any kind, right up to the moment that it happened.
Didn't have anybody saying, listen, be on some kind of special alert because Osama bin Laden or somebody else may be striking?
Not other than what the situation has been for the last 3 or 4 years, where, obviously, given the tensions in the world, there's almost a continued alert, but no specific information, no warning of any kind. And I've checked both with the police department and the FBI, and they had no warning.
Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, I appreciate you speaking to us live on the telephone as we played some video.
I would just like to say to the people of New York and to the people of America that this country, the city of New York and the United States of America is much bigger and greater than this, and we're going to overcome this. We're going to get through it. We're going to overcome it, and we're going to prove that democracy and law is our future, not this kind of vicious, horrible, inhumane kind of terrorism.
Mayor Giuliani,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Dateline's Freeport, Louisiana, Barksdale Air Force Base. Air Force One is reported to have taken off from Barksdale Air Force Base, where we played a videotape of what the President had to say there a short while ago, for, we're told, points unknown. Now, to bring you up to date quickly on what's happened, particularly for those of you who may be joining us late or just tuning in, plane crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers in Lower Manhattan shortly before 9 a.m. this morning. Second plane crashed into the second tower of the World Trade Center shortly after 9 a.m. President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, called the crashes at that time an apparent terrorist attack and a, quote, national tragedy. Then an aircraft of some kind crashed into a helicopter pad at the Pentagon, damage, including some fatalities there. The Pentagon, of course, just outside Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. That was about an hour after the first planes, plural, crashed into the first towers here in New York. The Federal Aviation Administration shut down all aircraft takeoffs nationwide. One World Trade Center tower then collapsed shortly after 10 a.m., about an hour after being hit by the plane. American Airlines said one of its planes that crashed into the World Trade Center was American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked from after takeoff from Boston en route to Los Angeles. Senior law enforcement officials said a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Then later, senior federal officials said, well, no, that they might have been wrong about that. There was a report of a plane crash in the area of Camp David, the presidential retreat in rural Maryland. The facts on that have never been quite squared. And then there was what was described as a big plane crash, a strange one, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All those have been the events of this day so far. No one doubts that the casualties are extremely high in the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings. You just heard live on the telephone, Mayor Giuliani did not even want to speculate how many, but when the thousands were mentioned, he just said he didn't want to contemplate that the loss of life has to be high. How high, no one knows in the crash of these World Trade Center buildings. So that's the situation at this hour. We have with us in our CBS News World News headquarters in New York, R.P. Eddy, former official of the National Security Council. Thanks for being with us. What government, quote, continuity issues went into effect today? I'm puzzled. I think a lot of people are about what's happened with the president. Put this in some context. Give us some perspective, Mr. Eddy.
Well, the U.S. government has a plan called Continuity of Government that has been in place since the beginning of the Cold War to protect the constitutionally mandated succession of the executive. And when an event of this magnitude or this sort of threat appears, those programs go into effect and take the different principles that would potentially be in line of succession and put them in secure locations. So there's proximity issues, and there's also protection issues. The president would, as he has here, quickly move to Air Force One, which is a mobile command center that allows him a certain amount of protection and mobility, and other officials are moved to other secure locations throughout the country.
Why would the president not want to go directly to the White House and be seen in the center of the executive branch of government and in command there? Why not go directly back to the White House?
Well, the White House is the symbol of U.S. government. It's the home of the U.S. president, but it's also not the most secure location that one could imagine. Living in a democracy like we do, we expose ourselves to certain vulnerabilities, and we don't have our executive housed in armored cars. So the White House isn't an armored vessel. So the most secure location for him and the place he needs to be is wherever he is safe, and that doesn't tend to be the White House in a situation like this.
Was or was not the top levels of the government, were they not concerned today about a possible chemical or biological attack?
Well, I think when you have an event like this occurring, you have to recognize the psychology of the terrorists, if in fact it is a terrorist attack, and I can't imagine it's anything else, would be the same psychology that would drive them to do a chemical and biological attack. So if they were to undertake this kind of event, then you could suppose they would also be willing to do a chemical and biological attack. Although it should be noted that this kind of attack is much easier to pull off than an effective chemical or biological attack. This isn't a highly sophisticated terrorist attack. A chemical and biological attack takes a lot more planning and preparation.
On the basis of your experience in government as a former official with the National Security Council, would this kind of attack require some kind of state support for this act of terrorism?
I wouldn't want to make a guess on that question if it did or didn't actually have state sponsorship, but I don't think so. The reality is that a lot of the groups that would pull something like this would be ones that do have state sponsorship, and we know that. And I would bet dollars to donuts that we're going to find that whoever did do this did have state sponsorship of one degree or another.
R.P. Eddy, if you could stick with us here for a minute, we want to go to Elizabeth Caledon, one of our CBS News correspondents who's at Bellevue Hospital, one of the world's best-known hospitals here in New York. Elizabeth?
I'm standing by outside two of New York City hospitals, NYU Medical Center and Bellevue Hospital just down the street. The only way to describe it here is it's a scene of, I would say, organized chaos. There are hundreds of people lining up to give blood. Blood is going to be a big need in this situation. And also doctors rushing into work and family members looking for their loved ones. Now, Bellevue is one of the biggest trauma centers in New York City, so the majority of the most seriously injured patients will be taken here. The deputy director of emergency services here at Bellevue did tell me they have quadrupled the size of the emergency room. They have hundreds of doctors coming in from their days off, getting here any way they can to help with the situation. The way it's working is there is an emergency medical services team down at the site of the World Trade Towers. They are doing triage, determining which patients are the most severely injured and should be sent on to the hospital. And the doctors say so far they have no idea how many injured there will be. They are expecting thousands. They are prepared for thousands. They've gone through drills preparing them for this day many times, they say, and are also trying to cope with the psychological trauma of this situation. I'm Elizabeth Caledon, CBS News, reporting from NYU Medical Center and Bellevue Hospital.
This was videotape that Liz Caledon made a very short while ago. Now, the mayor of Washington, D.C. has declared a state of emergency there. According to the FAA, all U.S. commercial flights now have been accounted for, keeping in mind that the airlines have confirmed that at least 4 aircraft, commercial airplanes, were hijacked earlier in the day. American Airlines says that 2 of theirs, 1 each, hit the World Trade Center towers. So American Airlines says it was their hijacked planes, hijacked aircraft. What an incredible story this is. Hijacked planes crashed into the World Trade Center. Now, David Martin reports from the Pentagon. Remember, the Pentagon, an aircraft of some sort was crashed into a helipad. It caused damage and some fatalities and injuries at the Pentagon. David Martin now reports the aircraft carriers USS George Washington and John F. Kennedy have been deployed to New York with the amphibious the amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers that are part of their normal battle groups. Keep in mind that aircraft carriers do not sail alone. Of course, they have very large battle groups with them, and that the battle groups centered around the George Washington and John F. Kennedy have now been deployed toward New York City. Some of those ships also coming up the Chesapeake Bay to Washington. That is, that some of the battle carrier groups from these two battle carrier groups apparently going to be sent up Chesapeake Bay to Washington. The ships will provide hospital beds, humanitarian assistance, and of course defense for those two cities. Both the Washington and the Kennedy are out of Norfolk, Virginia. Now, R.P. Eddy, formerly of the National Security Council staff, I know that there's a scenario that a state enemy of the United States might want to have an attack at or about the same time that some terrorist attack. What would the U.S. military as a whole be doing today under the plan?
Well, as soon as this attack was reported, a coordinating subgroup of the White House was immediately called to effect, and all the cabinet officials that were involved with that met via secure teleconference to discuss the intelligence about the attack and the preparations to deal with further attacks and to deal with the catastrophic effects of this. And then the final thing they would probably discuss is if they could establish culpability and what kind of response would be necessary if they are able to figure out, who is behind this, if it's a state sponsor or not. And that usually takes a little while, though.
And our State Department, which has been responsible for trying to pressure the Taliban government of Afghanistan to give up Osama bin Laden unsuccessfully so far, where would they be in all of this at the moment?
Well, the State Department will be responsible for all international diplomacy that we do vis-a-vis this attack, including talking to the Taliban, which we do through certain channels, actually here in New York, to explain to them that, and we have previously, that we hold them responsible for any attack that occurs against U.S. citizens by the Taliban, by the Osama bin Laden. So that message has gone out again. I'm sure that we've insisted that they give us any cooperation that they might be able to, and we've asked that of our allies and other countries around the world. Part of that will be intelligence sharing, and part of that would be deploying of resources.
R.P. Eddy, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
James Kelson, who was formerly head of the New York City FBI office and was the assistant director of the FBI, and is on the, not just on the telephone, he's with us now, former director of the FBI office in New York. Jim, it's good to see you again. Put this in context and perspective for us, and let our viewers, listeners know you were in charge of the investigation of the TWA-800 crash investigation, have a lot of experience with this kind of thing. Give us some context.
Dan, it's a huge event. It's a black day. In my view, it's a bigger event than Pearl Harbor. It's war. It's declared war, and we need to now pull together as a nation and accomplish a bunch of things.
Well, nearly everybody's been talking today about the FBI's role, and obviously the FBI has a large role, but the FBI alone cannot possibly investigate something such as this. What other agencies, what other resources the U.S. government pulled in to find out who's responsible for this?
Well, all the intelligence agencies, the CIA, NSA, law enforcement at every level, work together on a daily basis as a team now. The idea, though, that we can know everything, and obviously we didn't know everything. When I say we, I'm talking about that team that I used to be a part of. This event happened, so we did not stop it from happening. It's terribly difficult in a free society with open borders, and on any given day, people land at Kennedy Airport and other gateways undocumented. It's very difficult, and particularly with Middle East terrorism, these cells are not joined together. The only thing that joins them together is their hatred for us, our way of life, our foreign policy.
Well, Jim Kelson, you say that these various terrorist organizations are not necessarily as well connected as we sometimes might imagine them to be. Give us some perspective on who among the world's states helps them with what they do. I'm not suggesting that we know anything about who did this today, but the questions just tumble out. Well, can someone do this without some state support from someone like Iraq or Iran?
Well, Dan, whether or not this is state supported, there has been state support over the years, and if this was 1% or 10% or 100% state supported, I don't know. I'm a civilian now. I'm sure that the FBI and the agency and all the other intelligence apparatus of the free world, for that matter, is trying to figure out exactly who's behind this. And we need to act with massive power, in my view, without a lot of collateral damage, and that's difficult to do. But this is an act of war, and we need to act accordingly. Now is the time to step up to the plate and do the things that we need to do here as a country.
Jim Kellstrom, when you were still active with the FBI, true or untrue that there were a number of terrorist acts in which the threads of evidence led back to certain states, but that for reasons, perhaps understandable reasons of diplomacy and what we call geopolitics, there was a tendency to say, well, we may know that, but we don't want to deal with it. True or untrue?
No, I think that's true, Dan. I think that obviously there has to be balance in actions that we take. I mean, these events look very clear once they happen. I mean, now that this horrific act has happened, and then we have untold dead people in New York and Washington and some airplane in Pittsburgh, it's crystal clear that we need massive, effective, high morale law enforcement intelligence. We need to act as a unified country. We need to stop the hypocrisy. Not that hypocrisy got us to this day. I'm not saying it did. But this is serious business. And those of us in law enforcement over the years, and intelligence work over the years, didn't know what day this would happen, hoped it would never happen, but thought surely someday it might happen. I mean, we saw the World Trade Center bombing. We saw in the United States. Then we saw events, the Blind Sheikh going to blow up the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, the United Nations building, the FBI building. We saw Ramzi Youssef plot in the Philippines, well, after he escaped the United States, to blow up 9 or 10 jumbo jets simultaneously. We saw the bombing of the Cole. We saw the bombing of the barracks in Saudi Arabia. We saw the bombing of our embassies in Africa. There's plenty of evidence that people hate us for who we are, what our foreign policy is. And we need to act. And we need to act together as a country.
James Kellstrom, formerly head of the FBI office in New York and a man who helped run the FBI for a long while. Thanks for being with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
Rulers.
U.S. intelligence services don't appreciate. But is it not similarly possible that 3 members, just 3 men of one organization, could agree on, what is the date today? The 11th?
11th.
On the 11th of the month at such and such an hour would try to hijack 3 airplanes and try to crash them into a building. Might it not be as simple as that?
No, Peter, it simply can't be. Because first, flying an aircraft into a building, a pilot is not going to commit suicide in ways that kill thousands of extra people. It is not something that you're going to do by pointing a gun at a pilot's head.
Okay.
You're not going to take an aircraft out of pattern and suddenly divert 3 aircraft without creating virtually any warning because the attacks are so close together. You're not going to be able to bypass the security measures in 3 different airport locations. You're not going to be able to take over an aircraft with 1 man, particularly if you want it to fly a suicide mission. And you are not going to be able to add to this potential additional cases where aircraft have crashed that may also have been at terrorist hands.
Very interesting. Now, Tony, let me just take this a step further. Your business of the pilot issue is really to the point, which was, who knows, a commercial airline pilot who's going to deliberately fly his aircraft into a building, even at the cost of his own life in the cockpit. So you do presume that somebody else is in the seat flying this aircraft.
That's right, Peter, and I think we need to understand that the very sophistication of these aircraft make them much easier to fly, that it is much easier to program them to change their course. It doesn't take a pilot with vast experience to fly 1 mission ending in killing large numbers of people. But they do have to be trained. They do have to know something about the simulator, at least, inside the aircraft. And even if they have the pilot under their control, they have to know a lot about the way planes fly to force a pilot to be so precise in their targeting.
You make very good points, and you therefore assume that there is a lot of money involved in an operation like this.
I think that's a dangerous assumption, Peter.
Okay.
We always use these phrases, $100 million or $10 million. What it requires is a lot of political commitment, ideological commitment. It isn't something 3 people can do. It is potentially something that perhaps 30 or 40 can do. It is possible that only one major cell of some terrorist organization is involved. But I think we also have to ask another question now, and that is whether some state that hosted this movement knew about it and assisted, because there are elements of sophistication which raise that prospect.
Stay with us for a second, Tony, because Vince Canestraro, who also talks on the subject of terrorism and does more than talk on the subject of terrorism for us, is also here at the moment. Vince, do you want to make some comments about this?
Yeah, Peter, I think that Tony makes some good points about the complexity and the sophistication of the operation. But I think also we have to see what kind of organizations in the past have been willing to do such a coordinated attack.
Why is that a clue?
Because it's a pattern. We see people who committed suicide in these operations. So that points us away from a secular organization to a religiously oriented group. We've seen a pattern of planning against 5 U.S. airliners in 1993 with Ramzi Youssef when his safe site was inspected in Manila in '93. The FBI found evidence that he had been planning to hijack and blow up in flight 5 United airliners flying out of the Far East. Now, that was a very ambitious operation, and I don't think anyone believed that he could actually have done it. But here we are some 8 years later, and we see a coordinated operation and 3 planes hijacked and blown up against targets, obviously suicide operations, bringing a lot of other people with them. So that tends to point us towards a religiously organized group, perhaps towards Al-Qaeda, but again, with some state support. We've seen these groups evolve in their professionalism over the last several years. We go from...
Vince, can I just interrupt you for one second, just to try to keep you on the straight and narrow here? It may be a reach to blame. It may be a reach to blame a religious organization. I agree that we've come to accept the notion that some members, some people who worship Islam in the Middle East have found a better life giving themselves up, as we say. But aren't you sort of already directing and creating something of a mindset about an investigation that's more complicated than that?
Oh, certainly. And there's no question that this group, whatever it was, had some professional support, perhaps from a military and a state. The explosives, the way you would fly an aircraft. But it does point towards a group that has members who are willing to kill themselves in carrying out a punishing act against the United States. And there are only a few groups like that we know of. Secular radical Palestinian groups traditionally don't do this kind of thing.
Right.
We haven't seen that. The ones that we've seen that carried out suicide bombings tend to be Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, and of course Hezbollah. And so you've got basically a handful of potential suspects. None of this proves anything, of course, but it does tend to focus an investigation.
Let me ask you both, you, Vince, and then Tony Cordesman second. Just on the basis of history and on the basis of your own individual expertise, what do you think the chances are of the United States finding out who did this? First of all, you, Vince.
I think that there's a fairly good chance of finding out who did this because the people who did this are going to brag, they're going to talk, they're going to try and claim credit in a way that doesn't bring attention directly to them. But they will talk to other people, and some of our intelligence resources will pick this up, and that will lead us in a certain direction. And then they will go back to the database of threat warnings that they've had in the recent past. The U.S. has had a worldwide terrorism alert for some time that was just renewed yesterday, but again, the focus of those threats was abroad, U.S. installations abroad. They'll go back and see whether or not some of their intelligence operations that were picking up these threats may have been the recipient of deception. In other words, the group that may have done this may have been broadcasting deceptive information that we thought was legitimate threat information against a foreign installation, while they were really planning to do this kind of an operation.
Thanks very much, Vince Canestrano. I'll go to Tony Cordesman right away, but I just want to remind people, if you watched the news yesterday, you noticed that you recall that we reported that a man named Ahmad Massoud, who was the last independent militia leader, not member of the Taliban in Afghanistan, was, we believe, killed. There's still some debate about whether he's dead or not, but certainly was attacked by his enemies, one of them disguised as a television cameraman. And the United States was very open to admit that what the United States lost when Massoud was killed yesterday was access into Afghanistan for U.S. intelligence operatives. And so I turn now to Tony Cordesman for a quick comment on how quickly, how easily, how complicated, how difficult, how impossible might it be to find out who did this?
Peter, let's consider several realities. We never found and punished the people who blew up the Marine Corps barracks.
In Beirut.
That's right. We have never really addressed who led the attack on Al-Khobar, and the people who've been punished were at the lowest possible level.
Those are the civilian and military barracks in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. And when we go back to Libya and what happened to Pan Am 103, one person has been imprisoned. We have never gone beyond attacking low-level people in an incident of this magnitude to attack the leaders and the core of the group with success. But we have never before really encountered things so serious that we are on the edge of war.
And in the case of Pan Am 103, the United States alternated between blaming Syria for supporting the operation and or Libya, which supported the operation. So you're really reaffirming how complicated this is.
More than that, Peter, I think the key element is that if any state is involved in this in any way, if it knew this was going to happen or it shoulders a movement once we identify it, we find ourselves with issues about war and peace, which we have never before encountered in terrorism.
Well, you certainly put your finger on one more part. I'd like you to hold that, Tony, for a second, because nothing could be more, in some respects, potentially dangerous at the moment. But let's not lose focus for today. We'll come back to Tony Cordesman and talk about America.
As many people as possible, save as many lives as we possibly can, and make the city as secure as possible. The subways are running in the rest of the city. Lexington Avenue starting to run again. So people need to use the subway to get out of Lower Manhattan. They'll be able to use the subway. And we need people out of there so that the rescue efforts can go on all during the afternoon. I suspect they'll be going on through the night. And we'll be getting relief from the National Guard and the federal government later today.
Mr. Mayor, any indication on the ballpark number?
I don't want to. Obviously, there are all kinds of numbers that are swimming in my head as to what the numbers must be, but I don't know. I have no idea what the numbers are. It's horrible. I think any of you that saw this have probably never seen anything like this before. That people jumping out of the building, and it's a horrible thing to see.
In terms of the police mobilization, maybe the commission can tell us how, what's going on downtown. Have you brought in additional cops, presumably from all over?
There's additional resources coming from all over the city. We've activated off-duty MOS to come in. We're getting the assistance of New Jersey and the outer line counties, and they're all kind of pushing in toward Lower Manhattan.
Are you either of you hearing anything from the federal government with regard to either what's going on in Washington or intelligence or anything out of the federal law enforcement?
The only thing that we've heard is what I guess is publicly available, that the Pentagon was attacked, that there were other apparent attempted attacks in other parts of the country, some of which were stopped. And I'm not sure I know how accurate all that information is, but it appears as if there have been either attacks or attempts to attack various parts of the United States.
Commissioner Bonnet?
That's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York City. On that last point, he said that he had no confirmation of that. We have heard no word whatsoever of other attempted attacks across this country. Any number of states, as you might expect, and municipalities are on the highest possible state of alert. In Florida, Disney World has shut down and evacuated everyone from those facilities. That's been true of many of the entertainment centers in California as well. The Liberty Bell and Independence Hall have been closed, with other national monuments in the Philadelphia area. In Texas, some buildings were evacuated. Of course, all airports across America were closed down as well. In Washington, in Alaska, all military forces there are on the highest possible stages of alert. In Alabama, that's the home of the Redstone Missile Command Center, Marshall Flight Center. That has been closed today as well. No one knows if these terrorists might still attack again today. It does appear now, and I want to add a cautionary note to all of this. It appears now that this first wave of attacks is over. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now. Robert, do you know all the planes that were in the air that were not hijacked? Have they arrived safely at some destination?
That's a very, very important piece of information, and the FAA has just been able to confirm it, that the last of any scheduled domestic flights, last of the domestic flights that were in the air are now known to have reached their airports. So there is no other domestic flight that's unaccounted for. The implication is there's no other hijacked flight up there, that this is over as an event. Now, having said that, there are some international planes still in the air. There were 22 as of about an hour ago. Now the FAA is saying that's down to a limited number. So apparently many of those have landed at this point. The remaining international flights, they're all inbound, are headed for the West Coast. So they were, initially the idea was to divert them to Canada, and then they said they should land in the U.S. So those planes are still in the air, but in terms of these domestic airliners, as you say, there were 4 hijacked, 4 hit targets, and 1 went into a rural area of Pennsylvania, so that accounted for all 4 known hijackings. Now at this point, any other plane that's still in the air, and this is all triggered by the fact that the FAA put a hold on any new flights leaving airports as of 9:30 this morning. So these are the leftovers of those that were already in the air. Now they're all on the ground and all accounted for, so there appears to be no more threat in the air. Tom?
Any indication from the FAA on when they may lift the grounding of all flights in this country?
There is absolutely none, and I suspect that in spite of the pain it will cause the nation, that this is going to last for quite some time, because I wouldn't think they'd want to put craft back in the air until they know more about how this all came about. So I'm imagining at a minimum that this is going to last into tomorrow and could be beyond that, as again, in spite of the economic hardship to the nation and hardship to people. But I think we're in for a long haul here in terms of grounding air traffic.
Yeah, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager. It does pose all kinds of problems because people travel for reasons other than vacation. Obviously, business, you can deal with that as well these days with the internet and with faxes. But what about funerals or medical emergencies of one kind or another? We'll have to find a way of dealing with that within our air traffic system in America, too. And you can be sure that security is going to change radically in the next 24 hours when you go to an airport, because 4 airplanes were hijacked today. And they were used as guided missiles, in effect, by terrorists attacking American institutions. This is also having an effect overseas. The stock market in Germany has been evacuated because of a bomb threat. And in Great Britain, the Prime Minister has banned all civil flights over that country. Let's go to NBC's Keith Miller now in our London bureau. Keith?
Tom, an extraordinary ripple of shock, anger, horrific went right through Europe. At least 3 governments went into cabinet emergency meetings. Tony Blair, of course, canceled all civil flights. He also had a special emergency cabinet meeting. They evacuated several large buildings here as well. The horrific occurrence in the United States has rippled right across the world. Tony Blair had this statement to make a little bit earlier tonight.
I have just chaired an emergency meeting of the British Government Civil Contingencies Committee, and I would like to explain some of the measures that we have agreed to take here. There are a range of precautionary measures. We have stepped up security at airports to the highest levels. No flights will take off from the United Kingdom for which we cannot apply the highest standards of security for aircrew and passengers. Private flights have been stopped except where specifically authorized. Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises. The police across the whole of the UK are on full alert. All our defense facilities around the world have been moved to high alert to ensure the protection of British service personnel. Advice has been given to major financial and business institutions about appropriate security measures. A number of other security measures have been taken, and of course we are in close touch with US, European and other allies, and are cooperating with them on issues of security. All relevant ministers remain in communication, and the committee, the Civil Contingencies Committee, will meet again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Obviously, some of these measures, not least the effect upon airports, will lead to some disruption, and I hope people understand that. But other than the specific measures we have taken, or that we have advised others to take, business and everyday life can continue as normal. As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
The British Prime Minister very eloquently put into words what many world leaders are telling both their cabinets and their armed forces. The Germans called this act in America mass murder. The French said it needs to be eradicated. Tom?
NBC's Keith Miller, who is in our London bureau tonight with a roundup of European reaction and specifically the reaction of British Prime Minister Tony Blair. On the phone with me now is Warren Rudman, former senator from New Hampshire, national security affairs expert and co-chairman of the U.S. Commission on National Security. Senator Rudman, we've been hearing from one official after another that they were not surprised that there was a terrorist attack, but they were stunned by the complexity and the efficiency and the sophistication of this one. Do you share that?
No, I don't. I certainly was not surprised, and I'm not the least bit surprised at the extraordinary efficiency in which these horrible people carried out this attack against defenseless American citizens. But, you know, from what I have looked at over the last few years, we're dealing with some very sophisticated people who are very well financed and, given the time, can carry out attacks of this kind, as well as the thing that we all worry about, and that is attacks with weapons of mass destruction, as opposed to today's attack, which was a weapon of mass disruption.
But this had so many moving parts to it. Where was our intelligence community?
Well, of course, Tom, the first thing people want to ask is that question. It's a legitimate question, and we've looked at it, and we looked at it in our commission, which, of course, defined this issue as the #1 security issue facing America. Unfortunately, these are very difficult targets to penetrate. Some of these organizations, we don't even know that they exist. You can't get operatives into their midst. Very hard to find out who they are, where they are. My suspicion is that the people who carried out these attacks are people who have been probably filtered into this country over a period of months or years and have planned the attack and found a way to penetrate airport security. Once they did that, and they had people able to operate the aircraft, obviously what followed is no surprise.
Senator, how is this country going to have to change in the immediate aftermath of this declaration of war? And it's nothing short of that.
Well, it is a declaration of war. I compared it this morning in many ways to the country's attitude about defense in the 1930s or 1940, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and this country galvanized itself into action. This is another Pearl Harbor. This is a horrible attack on defenseless American citizens. I'm sorry to say I don't think it's the last. We have to do a lot with our intelligence, but more importantly, I think we have to do something about reorganizing our defense of this homeland into a rational organization that can deal with the aftermath, which, as you in New York can see, is just too horrible and too complex to contemplate. We've got to do that, and I must say that both the Congress and the administration have reacted to our report, which was issued in March. People are starting to look at ways to do this. It will take some time, but I hope not too much time.
There was going to be a very big debate in Washington, as you know, about the missile defense shield and about the reorganization of the United States military. You think the emphasis will now shift?
Well, Tom, I can only speak for the 12 or 13 members of this commission, and I will read to you just one short sentence. And we said, quote, "This commission believes that the security of the American homeland from the threats of the new century should be the primary national security mission of the U.S. government. With all due respect to the things you speak of, it is our collective belief that this nation has to organize itself both to try to prevent these things from happening and, as important, to find ways to deal with them when they do happen, as they will inevitably with the kind of determined foe that we are facing."
Thank you very much, former New Hampshire Senator Warren Rudman. We are looking at stunning pictures once again of people in lower Manhattan as they began to flee the canyons of Manhattan when the World Trade Center, first one building, one tower, and then the other began to come down. There is a real funnel effect in those narrow corridors in lower Manhattan, and the winds did take on a kind of tornado-like force. Ron Insana and others who work for NBC who were in the midst of all that described it as pitch dark and terrifying for a full 2 minutes at least. Many of them had to seek sanctuary either by breaking through windows, as Ashley Banfield did, into an apartment building, or getting into a car. CNBC's Ron Insana remains with us now. Ron, you've now been able to see those other videotapes that we've been showing of what it's like down there, and I think you used the phrase earlier, nuclear winter, and that's so apt.
And Tom, in some ways, I mean, if you can envision again that scene in Independence Day, that terrifying alien movie that showed New York City exploding in a horrific fireball, without the fire, that is exactly what the corridors in lower Manhattan look like. That's those huge plumes of smoke ripping through the streets and really overwhelming the entire community. It stretched for many, many blocks, the after effects of the implosion of that building, and to be standing in the middle of it, it was indeed pitch black, and had there not been an open car in which to hide, I'm not quite sure in what capacity I would be right now. But for quite a considerable time after the building came down, the air in lower Manhattan was thick, deep gray, unbreathable in many ways. Many people trying to take refuge in buildings that were open to the extent that there were some, or in automobiles, or any place where they could get breathable air.
All right, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was one of the survivors today when he went through to cover the story and then the building began to come down. No one could have anticipated that it would happen as swiftly or as catastrophically as it did. It does lead one to wonder whether there was a secondary explosion of some kind within the building, although it did take, in both instances, a terrible, terrible hit at the top. These buildings are secure. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. It managed to survive that. But nonetheless, the full effect of these two airliners, both considerable in size with a lot of fuel on board, brought down two of the iconic buildings in Manhattan. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell now, who has been keeping track of national security matters and the State Department. Secretary of State Colin Powell is en route back from Peru, we're told. Andrea, do we think he'll come to Washington?
That's correct, Tom. We're not sure that he will come to Washington. He's en route back from Lima, Peru. He was to have gone to Bogota, Colombia today, never got that far. He was at an OAS, an Organization of American States meeting in Lima, Peru, and gave a statement about this terrible attack on our nation, an attack which he described as a military attack, and then left. We're not sure where he is going to be going. As you know, the Vice President is at a secure location, Mrs. Bush at a secure location. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, was conducting National Security Council meetings in the Situation Room at the White House, even though the White House was evacuated. The State Department Operations Center relocated across the river to another location in Virginia. And George Tenet, the CIA director, was still holding meetings, but in a secure, separate location in Langley. temporarily while the rest of the CIA did evacuate. The CIA director on February 7th testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee that there was one person who was capable of coordinated, sophisticated, multiple attacks on the United States with no warning, and that was Osama bin Laden. Now, obviously, there are other collateral groups such as Al-Qaeda in Egypt, based in Egypt, that are closely associated with him, and it's very easy to, as Warren Rudman has warned us against, to speak without knowing fully who is really responsible. But clearly he is top on their list of possible suspects because of motive, because of means, because of opportunity, because of finances. And as Senator Rudman pointed out to you, this is the kind of attack, Tom, that had to be organized for many, many months. Just as we discovered during the testimony by bin Laden associates who were turned by the FBI and testified in the World Trade Center bombing trial, and also in the trial, of course, of the embassy bombings. These people work for months in advance. This is not a response, let's say, to recent events in the Middle East. This is something that was in the planning for many, many, many months.
Yeah, this is a terrible wake-up call for America. So many times we're lulled into the impression that far-off events don't have an effect on us in this country, or when there is a shooting at the CIA, as there was a few years ago, or when we had the bombing of the World Trade Center. Those trials went on, didn't generate a lot of attention. But Andrea, let's talk for just a moment, if we can, about foreign policy in the United States, about what was on the agenda before this day. The President was going to China in October. The UN meeting will be coming up in the fall. How will all this be affected?
Well, all of these events will be affected in extraordinary ways. We had already seen that economic and global meetings could no longer be held without not only the threat of protests, but without massive protests interrupting the schedule of international gatherings. The UN meetings in New York in September were already going to be very, very difficult to conduct, always have been, as you know. But now it is difficult to imagine how the president can travel safely, how other officials can gather for these international meetings without such an extraordinary degree of protection that the meetings cannot be held as originally envisioned and cannot be held really very effectively. We've seen not only the comments from Europe, but we've seen comments from the top leaders in China and elsewhere, all government leaders horrified by what has happened here in the United States. But this really will change us in profound ways. You and Tim Russert were talking about the psychological effects. We thought after the embassy bomb attacks, when airport security was stepped up so importantly, that we were in a new world. But now we've seen, much to the shock of most Americans, that we are vulnerable to hijackings. We thought that hijackings were events of the 80s domestically here in the United States, not of the late 90s and turn of the century. So this is really a new world as far as our own sense of vulnerability, especially as we travel.
Thank you very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We're told now by the FAA that the ground stop, that is, all flights in this country, commercial flights and other private aircraft, have been grounded until at least noon tomorrow. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager, who's been monitoring the situation for us at the FAA. Bob?
Right, Tom. It's all domestic flights, all commercial domestic flights. The prohibition on takeoffs and landings lasts at least until noon tomorrow, and then at that point they'll reassess it, so it may go beyond that. And then the same holds for international flights. All outbound flights to Europe and Asia, or anywhere, South America, and any inbound flights from overseas or foreign countries, all that is grounded at least until noon tomorrow, and then the agency will reassess it after that.
Bob, when you said all commercial flights will be grounded, what about private planes as well? There's a huge traffic in that these days.
Yeah, and it would apply to all private flights as well. Now, there are some areas where it's more difficult for the FAA to police because they don't have the towers and they don't have the airports manned. But it is to be a ground on all air travel. And I wouldn't be absolutely positive on all of the general aviation flights. And I know, of course, there'll be some exceptions for humanitarian reasons where you have to move, particularly people who are dealing with this crisis here and there. So there'd be those sorts of exceptions. But what I do know is that scheduled domestic flights and scheduled international flights, inbound and outbound, everything is grounded until midday tomorrow.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager. We've been talking about this in a kind of large sense without personalizing it, because we don't know, first of all, how many people were killed altogether. 266 died in the airplane crashes. We can only suspect that some of them will be well known because these were flights from Washington, from Boston to Los Angeles. That was American Airlines Flight 11. That was the first one to go into the World Trade Center. 92 people on board. Flight 77 and another American Airlines headed from to Los Angeles with 62 on board. Those flights from the capital to the West Coast always have prominent people on board. Flights 175, United Airlines, Boston to Los Angeles, 65 on board, and Flight 93, Newark to San Francisco, 45 on board. All transcontinental flights with a heavy load of fuel. This is Mayor Giuliani of New York City. Let's join his news conference live.
It's something that we've had nightmares about, but probably thought wouldn't happen. My heart goes out to all of the innocent victims of this horrible and vicious act of terrorism, acts of terrorism. And our focus now has to be on saving as many lives as possible. We have hundreds of police officers and firefighters who are engaging in rescue efforts in Lower Manhattan. I want to thank Governor Pataki for the incredible cooperation and coordination, and including deploying the National Guard that will be available to relieve our police officers and firefighters and emergency workers in the next couple of hours. The governor and I just spoke to the President of the United States. The coordination with the federal government from the time of the first attack has been excellent, including closing off the airspace around Manhattan and doing everything that can possibly be done in the face of this barbaric act to make the city secure. And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists, that our democracy, that our rule of law, that our strength and our willingness to defend ourselves will ultimately prevail. And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal. Everything is safe right now in the city, and the people who are doing the relief effort need all the help they can get. And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. The first step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk, and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made ready support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the President, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, well, this is a horrible attack, and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude. We will get through this, and we will continue to have a great and free country, state, and society.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any
Mayor Giuliani
of us can
and
bear.
Governor Pataki, the two Republican leaders of this state, joined together of common track dealing with a crisis of unbelievable proportions for both of them. Is this city has been struck in an act of war by terrorists. You're looking now at the Manhattan Bridge, which leads out of Lower Manhattan into the various boroughs. That one going over into Brooklyn those of you who come to New York always remember the Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg Bridge in that sequence from the lower part of the city on BMW. These are people who didn't have access to subways or cars because the tunnels are closed, and they're walking home, as any number of people are. New York, as Governor Pataki said, is so diverse in so many ways, but it is always united with the enormous sense of pride and survival and people helping each other as they are today. And that is the lower end of Manhattan, one of the great cities in the world that has been struck in an act of war today by 2 hijacked airliners, the hijackers unknown. Richard Shelby of Alabama, Senator, Senate Intelligence Committee. We're told that you've been getting a briefing. What do we know at this hour, Senator?
I've had a partial briefing, but after 4 o'clock this afternoon, I've been told that some people with the CIA and the FBI is going to brief Senator Bob Graham, who is the chairman of the committee. I'm the vice chairman. I was a former chairman. As to the events, what they know up to this point, who's responsible at this point. It's a little premature, but about 30 minutes ago I was talking to some people. Everybody's deeply concerned about what happened. We should be. You mentioned war. This is war. I've said several times that this is a different type of war. It has no boundaries. We've been pushing the intelligence committees for 7 years now that I've been on the committee to do everything they can, and I think we've got to do more. But my first thoughts, Tom, go out to the families. You know, this is a terrible, terrible day for America. It's a wake-up call, though.
And what do we do after we get the wake-up call in terms of how this country must change? Obviously, security at airports will have to be tightened considerably when you have 4 planes taken, including one from the nation's capital. What else is going to have to happen?
Well, that's one, and I think we can do much better around the airports. I think we've come a long way with security. We're an open society. We want to stay that way because that's what makes this country great. We cannot hunker down and live in bunkers. We will not, I predict. But I think we can do a lot more. I'm waiting the briefing as to see if there was any inkling, any warning whatsoever. If not, then this was a heck of a well-executed, dastardly deed today. And I'm afraid it'll be more.
And that's the other question I was going to ask you in that partial briefing. Did you get any assurance that the worst seems to be over?
No, they wouldn't say that. They would be very careful as to saying what would come next because nobody knows that. But we are on alert. The president has put the military on alert all around the world. That's good. I guess we're going to have to stay on alert to some extent, be alert to possibilities because this is a dangerous groups that we're dealing with now.
Is the president going to have to stay out of Washington for 24 hours?
I don't know. I'll leave that up to him. He will be advised by the people who give him security warnings and so forth. But I think sooner or later the president will come to the Capitol. He should come to the Capitol and reassure the American people. But that will be up to him, Tom.
All right, Senator Richard Shelby, Vice Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, thank you very much for being with us today. We'd like to be able to talk with you again if we can after that 4 o'clock briefing. I know you can't give away details, but if we can invite you back, Senator, we'd like to do that. Let's go to NBC's Campbell Brown now, who is covering the White House from outside the fence. Campbell?
Well, Tom, we don't know where the president is right now, and that is, of course, deliberate given the security concerns. They are going to great extremes to protect him at this moment. He started off the day in Florida, then flew to the Barksdale Air Force Base, which is in Louisiana, near Shreveport, North Louisiana. And it was there that he made a statement reacting to the attacks this morning. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense.
Now, Tom, we are told that the president took off from Barksdale Air Force Base for an unknown location. There are any number of places that he could have been taken. The most likely is a series of command centers that are set up across the country, all over the country, that are essentially communication centers where the president could speak with the military, where he could have access to the latest intelligence information. And the military officer who travels with the president at all times, this is the military officer who carries the nuclear codes, he also has a database with him of all of these communication centers around the country. All of them, or most of them rather, underground, where the president can both be protected and have that access, the most advanced electronics equipment that could give him access to his entire team, whoever he needed to talk to. Two in particular are worth noting here. One is Camp David. Underground at Camp David, there is a facility there, a special communication center, and of course Camp David is in Maryland along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. There is another place in that same location, Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, near the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, again called Raven Rock. And Raven Rock is the alternate National Military Command Center or Communication Center. If the Pentagon is the primary place where military operations are conducted from, Raven Rock is the backup location. Now, these two are worth noting, and we have no confirmation that they are in any way related to the plane crash near Pittsburgh, but they are in the vicinity of that plane crash in Pittsburgh and possibly could have been targets. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. As these stories began to unfold throughout the day, we're still operating really on two planes. It is surrealistic, but at the same time, it is one of the darkest days in America as we realize that this country has been attacked in an act of terrorist war in the heart of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., and also in New York City, and then a plane that was driven into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. We believe that that is the end of the attacks for now, but no one is sure because we don't know who is responsible. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklaszewski, who was in the Pentagon when that plane was driven into the Pentagon today. He heard a small explosion. Don Rumsfeld wouldn't get out at first, but I gather he, too, has been taken to a secure location.
Actually, Tom, what Don Rumsfeld did, according to Pentagon officials, is he was in his office on the opposite side of the building from where you see where the plane impacted, and he ran to the area where the fire and the fireball was still engulfing much of the Pentagon. And according to Pentagon officials, he actually assisted in helping some of the injured leave the building before he then returned to his office and then went straight to the National Military Command Center, again on the opposite side of the Pentagon, to monitor events where he now remains. Tom, this airplane that ran into the Pentagon, it happened within the hour from the two planes that ran into the World Trade Center, but it took a full 4 hours before firefighters and rescue workers could actually contain the flames and fire inside, so it was safe enough for them to enter the building. And that was about an hour ago when we were told that rescue workers did enter parts of the building where you can see where the plane sliced through the Pentagon. Now, it was actually fortuitous that the plane hit in this area, if that can be described as fortunate at all. As you see, Tom, the plane sliced through the building. It came in at an angle, flipped over on its right side, and hit actually at about the first and second floors. The third, fourth, and fifth floors were still intact immediately after the blast, but then later collapsed upon themselves. But to the right of that devastated area, you see there's not much fire damage. That's because that part of the building had recently been renovated with reinforced blast walls to prevent a kind of bomb attack, not an airplane attack, of course, but to prevent a bomb attack, and reinforced firewalls on the inside after the bombing at Oklahoma City. When the remodeling of the Pentagon was begun, it was decided to do it with extra reinforcement after Oklahoma City. Now, this area to the left, where you see most of the fire damage, that area was due to be remodeled shortly. And fortunately, a large number of those offices had already been evacuated. Now, there are confirmed dead, many injured. We don't know the exact number yet, And as rescue workers dig through that rubble, certainly the death toll here is going to climb. But really, it could have probably been much worse had this area on the right not been reinforced and the area on the left not been abandoned, really, to permit the redevelopment or reconstruction work that was to go underway. Now, according to eyewitnesses, it was an American Airlines 757 that came sort of from the direction of National Airport, and it just cleared the highway, which is adjacent, the highway ramps, which is adjacent to the Pentagon. But then it came in, and as it approached the Pentagon, almost at ground level, did a very hard right turn and actually flipped on its side and then sliced into the Pentagon on the first and second floors we see there. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky. In both that flight and the first flight, the American Airlines flight that hit here in New York, had similar patterns. They were flying at very, very low altitude, 1,000 feet according to some New York witnesses. And Bob Kerr said earlier that over Lafayette Park, just outside the White House, they saw a plane go over at a very low altitude that was out of the normal flight pattern for Washington, D.C. So obviously this had been well thought out. That goes without saying. The question is, what happened in the cockpit? Did the terrorists take the controls and drive those planes into the World Trade Center as well as into the Pentagon? And where was that plane that went down in Pennsylvania headed? Why did it go down there? Well, these were all flights that were originally headed for California. We don't have the tapes, obviously. The black box may be able to tell us something. This is the second plane going that you can see entering from right to left there that hit the second Trade Center tower at the World Trade Center here in New York, causing that enormous fireball. That is the first tower to go down. It was hit a little bit lower. It went down first, and the second one went down as well. So there are so many unanswered questions here. All across America, we know that people are watching with horror and with a great deal of apprehension. There are lessons to be learned from past experiences. Oklahoma City comes immediately to mind. Assistant Fire Chief was John Hanson, who became a very familiar figure and a friend to a lot of us, who's been through all of this. He's now retired from the department in Oklahoma City. John, first of all, this whole business of getting people out of the rubble in New York City and in the Pentagon, but the larger lessons about what we should learn about how we move on from here. What did you learn in Oklahoma City?
You know, Tom, that we can, in fact, do that. We were, you know, stung, we were wounded, but we're not going to be defeated, and we won't in this one. You've heard the President, Mayor Giuliani, the Governor of New York, all make the comments that we're going to stick together and get through this. We've got to be patient. We've got an incredible rescue effort that's going to take possibly months. You know, our rescue effort in Oklahoma City took 17 days. This, with the widespread destruction, will probably go into the months. We've just got to be patient and pull together and just take this head on.
There's so much that we learn from Oklahoma City as well in terms of rescue organization and rescue techniques.
You know, Tom, we had a team from the great state of New York in Oklahoma City. After Oklahoma City, the nation's fire service, FEMA, we all got together, reevaluated what we were doing. The New York City Fire Department is as prepared as any department in the country to handle this. With the support of FEMA and the rest of us around the country, we're going to help those great men and women get through this, just as they helped us back in 1995.
John, tell me, just from a personal point of view, where were you when you heard what had happened today, and what was your first reaction?
Tom, I was at home, and I heard about the devastation during the Today Show, watching Katie and Matt. And it just felt like I'd been gut punched, as the rest of the country. I stopped for a moment, looked at the video we saw on the Today Show, and just really couldn't believe it at a point. And then reflected on Oklahoma City and knew that we all had to go to work, band together, and help each other get through this. And we will. That's the beauty about America. We'll pull together and we'll get through this and send a message to the cowards who perpetrated this great crime against our nation.
Thanks so much. John Hanson from Oklahoma City, who went through his own trial by fire and shares with us today some of the lessons after the Murrah Federal Building was bombed, and he became such a familiar and reassuring figure to so many of us. We have some information that I can bring you up to date on now. The mayor here in New York said that 1,500 people have been brought to the Liberty State Park area, that is in the lower end of Manhattan, for those of you who come here from time to time, not too far from where the ferries go back and forth to Staten Island and over to the Statue of Liberty. 600 have been brought to the New York City area hospitals. 150 of those are in critical condition. New Jersey hospitals have not yet reported in. It's fair to say that that's about 2,100 altogether. Those are the people who have been recovered. We can only guess at how many hundreds more are trapped in the rubble on the ground or in what is left of the buildings. 30 patients.
There are very sophisticated continuity of government plans in Washington. They have evacuated most of the government office buildings. And I would imagine things are locked down pretty tight, and key officials have been moved to key locations, to secure locations to ensure that there is a continuity of government.
Jerry Howard, thank you for the moment. Don't go away if you feel inclined to stay and help. We're very grateful.
Yeah,
the man who set up these headquarters office down on the west side, which are now usable in terms of the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management. And management is the big issue. But as you listen to you two guys talk there for a second, you realize how this ripples out. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, has just now ordered, actually a short while ago, has just ordered all civilian flights to cease over London. And so the impact of this one event, not only across the United States, but now being felt overseas, is constantly alive. And there are a couple of new pieces of information, too, about the flights in question that we have been so focused on today. In the case of American Flight 11, this was the one that first crashed into the trade towers this morning at 8:48, just a little before 9 o'clock this morning. ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us now, says that a flight attendant called from the plane to say that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed and people on board the aircraft had broken into the flight deck, into where the captain and the co-pilot, and in the case of the 767, can't recall, they're not an engineer, but certainly broken into the cockpit where the pilot and the co-pilot were located. 2 hostages, two flight attendants stabbed. And in the case of United Airlines Flight 737, which was the aircraft the United Airlines was crashed just near Pittsburgh, Lisa does confirm for us our reporting of a little while ago that a passenger did call from a cell phone on the phone to an emergency service, a 911 emergency service. They managed to do from the air to say that, in fact, they were in the process of being hijacked. And Ann Compton, one of our White House correspondents, calls just a short while ago to say that the president has landed again, this time at an Air Force base in Nebraska. And this suggests, A, that the Secret Service is still very much in charge of the president's movements at the moment, and that there is a very strong feeling in the highest reaches of government that the president should stay on the move. He's going to stay there, conceivably, for the next little while, because we've also been told by Ann that he's going to speak to the National Security Council this afternoon on a teleconference. The president is going to stay abroad. I suppose you can do that from Air Force One as well. I'm not altogether sure. I think you probably can. But the president is going to talk to the National Security Council from somewhere other than Washington, and he is now in Nebraska. As I think Terry Moran, our White House correspondent, and others mentioned very early on in the day, it's a very delicate line for the president to follow. Stay on the move, lest there be any security threat to the president, and this will be absolutely decided by the national leadership of the Secret Service in conjunction with the National Security Council, while the political operatives in the president's entourage very much want him, we're told by Claire Shipman and others, to get him back to Washington to be in control in the place which is familiar to most Americans. And Mrs. Bush is, of course, we've already said, is at an undisclosed location, and Vice President Cheney, who carries an enormous load in this particular administration, is currently working out of the White House. John McCarthy, who covers the Pentagon, national security, and a good deal of terrorism and international intelligence issues for us, is at the Pentagon. John, what have you got?
A whole
plate full of things, Peter. First of all, we've been talking throughout the day about possible ship movements, American ship movements. It is true that 2 aircraft carriers, 5 other combatants, and a hospital ship are now all heading north along the Atlantic seaboard toward New York. No decision has yet been made about exactly what to do with those ships when they get there, but of course aircraft carriers have a very large hospital capability, so they could be used for that. I think it is a responsive measure. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, after the attack on the Pentagon, went immediately to the gash that you see behind me here when the very first destruction was detected and helped pull some people out of the rubble. He is now in what is called the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, and he intends to stay there indefinitely until all forces around the world have been secured. All forces around the globe at this point are at ThreatCon Delta, which is the highest level of threat condition that American troops can be in. One of the difficulties with the fire and the rescue effort here in the Pentagon, Peter, is we have seen continuous outbreaks of fires within the different levels of the Pentagon, and it has been extremely difficult for search and rescue people to get inside the Pentagon. It was 5 hours before the first people were able to get into some of the rubble to try to begin to pull out people who may have been trapped. The fire in the Pentagon was described as an inferno by those people who were in some of the worst areas. The evacuation in parts of the Pentagon was very orderly. Some of it was complete chaos, as you might expect.
Okay, John, thanks very much. John McCarthy at the Pentagon. We just take a quick look at John there. Jackie, there for a second? I want to put John on camera for a second because earlier today you described, you just turn around and take a look at that gash in the Pentagon there and describe again for us. You think it's what, 200 feet wide, 200 to 300 feet wide?
It is at least 200 or 300 feet wide, Peter. Just imagine a very large commercial aircraft ramming into this space. The Pentagon is built like a blockhouse, as you know, during World War II. It is a very substantial building, and this aircraft, traveling at between 150 and 200 miles an hour, penetrated deeply into the rings of the Pentagon, almost to the center. The destruction on the 5 floors that are above ground is considerable. One of the admirals was briefing us earlier that he felt that the section that was hit was one of the areas that was being repaired. We now believe that is not true. It is an area that was very fully staffed, primarily with Navy and Marine Corps personnel, but also the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Okay, thanks very much, John McCarthy at the Pentagon. We'll come back to you. On the phone with us at the moment is the former CIA Director, James Woolsey. Mr. Woolsey, there's so much to ask you about at a moment like this in terms of your experience, but as our political director, or actually that's not true, as a former senior White House official said a short while ago to one of us, there's going to be a hellacious amount of finger pointing at the moment. What's gone wrong here?
Well, one thing that's gone wrong, Peter, I think, is that for some years now, we have adopted a theory that terrorism first was likely just to be sort of a pickup team, these loose associations of terrorists inspired, say, by the Blind Sheikh in New York. This was the thought in the 2 bombings, one attempted, one real in New York back in the early 90s. And then the Clinton administration veered off into saying everything looked like it might be Osama bin Laden. It's important that we realize there is a real possibility when you have something this devastating and well-coordinated that there could be state action of some sort behind it. Now, I don't know that that's the case, and I won't say that it's the case, but there is at least a plausible case that there was Iraqi government involvement in the World Trade Center bombing back in 1993. This all has to do with the identity, the true identity of Ramzi Yousef, who was the mastermind who's in prison out in Colorado now. At his sentencing, the judge said, "We still don't really know who you are." And if there was a chance that there was Iraqi government involvement in that, since Yousef was the mastermind of the World Trade Center and of a bombing plot in the Pacific, which he was working on when he was caught, to have a lot of American airlines in the Pacific blown up. What happened today is a sort of amalgam of the earlier 2 Ramzi Yousef plots. It's at least, I think, interesting that that's the case. And if some of the observers, Laurie Milroy and others, are correct, that there's a reasonable chance that he was, in fact, involved with the Iraqi government, there could also be a chance that the Iraqi government is involved here, even if bin Laden or other terrorist groups are as well.
Can I just ask you just a couple of really elementary questions about intelligence? You've just done something on the air which strikes me as what intelligence officers do when they sit down to try to figure out what the heck is going on. Is that in fact, what you're trying to do at the moment? You called it an amalgam of two plots. Is that how it works at the moment?
Well, this is nothing but circumstantial evidence that I've been talking about, but it's interesting circumstantial information anyway. And yes, that's the sort of thing that I think intelligence officers need to do. Part of the problem with the World Trade Center bombing back in '93 is that most of the information about it was under grand jury secrecy until the trial, and after that, not many people paid attention to it. So even most of the federal government had no access to it except outside the FBI and parts of justice.
Now, you mentioned governments and individual organizations or operations. Don't governments traditionally leak information more than independent or semi-independent terrorist cells? If there were a government involved, is it not inconceivable that the United States didn't pick up something?
I think it's possible that a government could be involved and not be picked up, especially if it was operating very carefully, as the Iraqis or conceivably the Iranians might under these circumstances. It is normally somewhat easier to learn what's going on inside a government than a terrorist group, particularly one that doesn't use many communications and the like, and does everything within just a very small number of people. But it's not impossible that terrorist groups could work together with a government. The Iraqi government has been quite closely involved with a number of the Sunni terrorist groups, and on some matters has had contact with bin Laden. So,
I'm sorry, Mr. Woolsey, I think I just lost you.
I said on some matters.
Lost at the moment, and I hope we'll get him back on the telephone. The former director of the CIA, James Woolsey, on the phone, agreeing that there's going to be a heck of a lot of finger pointing at the FBI, at the Department of Defense, and at the CIA. No, I have my FP, thank you very much. I just lost the director of the CIA. Okay, thank you very much. Because, as this former official in the White House points out, people are going to demand massive retaliation. Mr. Woolsey raises two quite fascinating possibilities. One, that there is a terrorist organization or group involved with a government, that there is, as there has been believed in the past, a terrorist operation within the Iranian political establishment, which perhaps even other parts of the Iranian political establishment didn't know about, and similarly true, though much likely, for them to be operating in ignorance of Saddam Hussein inside Iraq as well. But the reason that, and I bring John Miller back briefly in on this again, the reason he suggests an amalgam, Mr. Woolsey does, of two footprints is because of the potential, never perfectly proved, that Ramzi Youssef, who has been on trial and convicted of the first trade tower attack, did seem to have some tenuous connection with Iraq.
And that this is a mixture of the two plots that were his two big capers. One, the plot to blow up numerous airlines on the Pacific route targeting American tourists. The other to blow up the World Trade Center. Here, planes, American carriers have been used to attack the World Trade Center.
Okay, I apologize.
No, as Mr. Woolsey pointed out, the difficulty with Ramzi Youssef and really getting to the bottom of the World Trade Center was, while he escaped as the mastermind and while he was captured in a guest house funded by bin Laden, nobody ever knew who sent him in the first place, or what his real nationality was, or even what his real name was, which set him apart from all the other people connected with those cases. Truly a mystery man, still in prison here in America.
As somebody said a little while ago, too, in terms of everything we're looking at now, suspects, there's no good options on the table in this regard whatsoever. Let's try to keep up with the running developments of the day. Lisa Stark is with us from Seattle. She covers aviation for us. And Lisa, when we last commented on the status of this plane, we have at least at least two of them in the process of being hijacked.
Right, Peter. Here's the latest information we know right now. We know, obviously, the 2 American planes were lost. Flight 11 from Boston to L.A., that is one of the planes that went into the World Trade Tower. Flight 77 from Dulles to Los Angeles, we believe that that may have been the plane that went into the Pentagon. The 2 United planes, United 93, that is the plane that crashed south of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And now United 175, that plane, the plane from Boston to Los Angeles, a government source has confirmed that that was the second plane that went into one of the World Trade Towers in New York. I'm also being told by government sources, and again, these things change throughout the day, Peter, I want to caution people, but this is what we know now. A government source tells me that on American Airlines Flight 11, again, that was the flight from Boston to Los Angeles that went into the Trade Tower, that a flight attendant on that plane was apparently able to call the American Airlines Operations Center to tell them that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed and that the perpetrators had broken into the flight deck. We've also been told that a passenger aboard one of the United flights, United Flight 93, the one that crashed in Pennsylvania, a passenger on that flight was able to call 911 apparently and let them know that the plane was being hijacked. Again, this information from government sources, and we don't know if it will hold up throughout the day, but that's what we are being told at this time.
I very much appreciate you bringing us up to date. There's one thing that I'm never quite clear on yet, and that may be just because where I'm sitting. Do we know American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles was a 767, is that correct?
Yes.
United Airlines 175, which went into the World Trade Center.
That was a 767
as well. The American aircraft plane, which we're a little uncertain about the crashing into the Pentagon, was it Boeing 757?
Correct.
And it was also a 757 that crashed near Johnstown.
Exactly.
So we have 2 very popular and very widely used and very important aircraft in these 2 airlines being used. Lisa, thanks very much indeed. On the phone from Washington with us now is the former Secretary of State, James Baker. Are you there, Mr. Baker?
I'm here, Peter.
So what would you do?
Well, it's a pretty tough one, Peter. It's everybody, of course, is in deep sorrow and shock. It seems to me that this is something we've been worried about for a long time. We've been able, fortunately, to foreclose it up to now. We may be entering a bit of a new era. We may have to do a bit more to preempt these types of events. We may need to get some better human intelligence to penetrate some of these groups before acts like this can be carried out. We may need to do even more to beef up. Obviously, I suppose we need to do even more to beef up our airport security. There's a lot along those lines, I think, that needs to be done, and mostly, I think, strengthen our intelligence capabilities.
You are the second person, second senior former government official to say to us today, to imply very clearly that human intelligence in those areas of the world which are to some extent breeding grounds of terrorism are plainly weak.
Well, they are weak, Peter. We went on a real witch hunt with our CIA back in the early mid-'70s. We had hearings. I won't mention the name of the legislator who conducted those hearings, but they, in effect, resulted in our eliminating a lot of our human intelligence capabilities. It's a dirty business. When you have human intelligence, you're doing business with the kinds of people that will commit these acts. Sometimes the first test of a human intelligence agent, the first test they send them out on is to go out and kill somebody. So it's pretty tough for America to get into that, and we got out of it. But it may be that we have to get into that kind of business.
Mr. Secretary, why don't you just name the legislator, because you're just going to cause more trouble for me to go to the file and look it up. Who held these hearings, and what's the point you're trying to make?
Well, they were the Church Committee hearings, and what I think we did as a consequence of those hearings was to, in effect, unilaterally disarm in terms of our intelligence capabilities. Now, we have the best, technological intelligence gathering operations and capabilities in the world, but we need this human intelligence to penetrate groups like the group that must have carried out these operations.
I have only a vague recollection of this, but I think the point you're making is that there are some forces, political and otherwise, in the United States, who believe that getting down and dirty with potential terrorists around the world is not something we should be doing, that we should do it all technically, therefore not put people at risk?
That's correct. That was the thinking, and that's pretty much the policy we followed since then. And I think we need to get back into the down and dirty business so we can penetrate these groups and hopefully prevent these types of things from happening in the future.
Mr. Baker, I don't want to get ahead of things, and I'm sure you do not either. But if there is, and as somebody said earlier, there are no good options out there at the moment. But do you believe that the United States is, if it finds out that a state is involved, going to have to go to war in an active way against that state?
Well, first of all, I don't believe we're going to find out that a state is involved. I cannot really, frankly, conceive of a state doing this. There could be, I suppose, some indirect assistance from a state or groups within a state, and I don't think that's going to be the case. But if it were the case, I think we need to do whatever we reasonably and responsibly can to protect the American people, whatever that involves.
Now, this is always the toughest question for somebody who has been in office but is not currently. How much easier is it to say what you do now that you're not in government? In other words, were you the Secretary of State in the Bush administration at the moment? Now, would you not feel rather constrained by modern circumstances as to what you could do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, frankly, Peter, we have some laws on our books that we ought to take a look at. One of them is simply a presidential executive order that says the United States doesn't go out and assassinate people. I think there was a very good reason behind that, but I dare say that you would have about 99%, if not 100% public support across the United States today if we found out that one terrorist group was responsible for these incidents. You would have 100% support almost for taking care of the person who leads that group.
One of the difficulties, of course, Mr. Baker, is that in a situation like this, we end up fighting like the terrorists to some extent, right?
Well, that is unfortunately the case. That's true, but it may be that that's the only way we can really take care of the problem. You know, the president said today, he made a statement I think was absolutely the right statement. He said America is under attack, under terrorist attack, and he said we are going to hunt down and punish those we find responsible for this. And that, to my way of thinking, means doing whatever is required.
Mr. Baker, thanks very much for the time.
Thank you.
James Baker, the former Secretary of State, also widely known in the country as the man who did as much as he did to win Florida for George Bush at the last presidential election, but a longtime member of the American political and foreign policy establishment, and who knows how complicated this is, and who makes it very open. You'll hear this a lot in the next few days. Not enough human intelligence, and we'll review who that legislator was. Tony Cordesman.
2 at the World Trade Center, 1 at the Pentagon. We go to Mika Brzezinski in downtown New York. Mika.
Well, Dan, behind the fire trucks and the smoke and all the confusion that is now 10 blocks behind me, right down the West Side Highway here, is a horrendous and unimaginable mystery. Who made it out alive? The trade towers have vanished, and in their place, an ominous, slow-moving plume of smoke. Evacuations were so quick from the scene, from schools and buildings and apartments. There was no cell phone service at all, added to the confusion, and there's so little information coming about it out of the scene about the injured and the dead that people are literally lining up on the West Side Highway waiting and watching. That is all they can do. Now, we know of terrorist acts throughout your reporting in other parts of the country, but it's safe to say most people here can barely deal with what happened right here in New York City. I'm joined by 2 guys here, Michael and Christopher, and they actually saw much of this disaster unfold before their eyes. First of all, Christopher, where were you?
I was in a nearby office building, several blocks away, in a conference room on the northwest corner of the building. So we unfortunately had a very clear, unobstructed view of both towers. About 20 of us in the building or so, colleagues actually, gathered on one of the floors, one of the high floors.
So you heard the first hit?
Yeah.
You gathered and saw?
At least I didn't see the first hit. So we kind of gathered in this room, and we're just kind of discussing the events. And just within a matter of minutes, we noticed, again, what appeared to be, in such a short period of time, what appeared to be a large commercial plane at a low altitude, high speed, just, going right into the second tower, and it collided with the tower. The plane disintegrated. The building shattered, basically, and just a ball of fire. And,
In the room, the
shrapnel.
people around you, what? Was it silence?
It was. It's kind of hard. It's kind of really hard to. I believe so. Just complete and utter disbelief.
Christopher, tell us a little bit about the chaos in trying to literally get from where you were to where you are now. I understand you ran down 46 flights of stairs. Take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as we saw the second explosion, essentially, we just thought we're in, a 50, 60 floor building. We could be the next target. So we had no idea what was happening. You see two explosions like that, and everybody kind of just realized, wait, we're in danger too. And people just started, I mean, it wasn't chaos. It was just everybody was going as fast as they could down the stairs, and going down 46, 50 flights, it was pretty tough. We get outside, and then all of a sudden you see just this fireball coming out of the towers, and it was just a surreal experience.
Yeah, and Bedlam. And the blasts, of course, Dan, as we know, there was 1, 2, and then 3 as the towers collapsed. And one security expert from inside the financial center said literally hundreds of people from beyond the police line were covered by the falling debris and the building itself. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski in downtown, lower Manhattan. President Bush, having started the day in Florida, made a short statement there calling this an apparent terrorist attack. Then he flew to Air Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, made another videotape statement there, somewhat longer in both statements, assuring Americans that their government was continuing to function and that those responsible for this would be found and be held accountable, and asking for the prayers and thoughts of families most directly affected by today's tragedies. Then the president flew on to Nebraska, to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where he was last reported to be receiving, quote, a briefing on the situation. And at that particular Air Force Base in Nebraska are the DEFCOM planes, which are aircraft outfitted particularly to carry presidents aloft in catastrophic situations. Not to say that President Bush is going to go on a DEFCON plane. So far as we know, he plans to continue to fly on Air Force One. But where he will go, where he'll wind up, we do not know. He did not go back to Washington as he said he was going to do out of Florida. More about that as we go later on. Now we're approaching the half-hour mark. Every half hour, an hour, we try to recapitulate what we know, what we don't know, bring you up to date on the situation, and we'll do that in a very few moments. But let me point out a couple of things before doing that. First of all, New York hospitals continue to be absolutely inundated with the wounded from today's events in and around the World Trade Center. Some patients have been taken to outlying hospitals, suburban hospitals outside the city. There is a shortage of blood, as you would expect under these circumstances, and the American Red Cross is keeping open the facilities for blood donations in the city, in those areas of the city that are not affected by the explosions and fire and events in Lower Manhattan. So those blood donation centers are open. The FAA says that air traffic, which has been grounded in the country in an unprecedented act since early this morning, that tomorrow noon is the earliest the FAA intends to have air transport authorized again. Overseas flights headed for this country were ordered to either U-turn or to find landing places outside the United States. NATO was holding what was described as an emergency meeting, which was due to begin about a half hour ago. A senior official is expected to brief shortly at FBI headquarters in Washington. We will, of course, be monitoring that, probably carry it live for you. Also at the Pentagon, where there's been very little information about the extent of damage today, understandably little information. The Defense Department wanting to give out as few details as possible, but there has been damage at the Pentagon. There have been some fatalities there. The Defense Department confirmed that several hours ago, and some injured. But we'll also be receiving a Pentagon briefing somewhere along the line this afternoon. The pictures you're seeing now on videotape are from the World Trade Center area. Let me point out that it wasn't just the collapse of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, one tower and then the other, where 50,000 people generally work on any given workday and where thousands more generally visit. but there were buildings around the World Trade Center that in the avalanche of debris, the concrete and steel and other materials raining down the whole area, there were other buildings in that section of New York, Lower Manhattan, that collapsed at or about the same time as the World Trade Center. The mayor of New York, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, has said that there's been a, quote, tremendous loss of life. In an interview with CBS News, he wouldn't even speculate as to how much loss of life. There, at last report, there were people known to be still alive in the debris of the World Trade Center collapse. Efforts were being organized to try to get to those people. Now, this is an unprecedented show of terrorist horror, what you're seeing today. The 110-story World Trade Center collapsed in this shower of rubble and dust and destruction after two hijacked airliners, the airliners carrying a lot of people themselves, slammed into the sides of the twin symbols of American capitalism. And Fuad Ajami from Johns Hopkins University pointing out that the two main targets today, one a symbol of America's economic power, the World Trade Centers, the other the symbol of American military power with the Defense Department. And no one can believe that those two main targets were selected at random. They were selected for their symbolic importance to the nation. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said, and I quote him again, "Now the number of casualties will be more than most of us can bear." Now, this was a systematic terrorist attack that included another hijacked plane crashing into the Pentagon. And we very early on this morning said that this was the Pearl Harbor of terrorism. And then following that, at least one U.S. senator picked up on that theme, comparing this to the incidents of 1941's Japanese Pearl Harbor attack that launched World War II. This day, national security was quickly moved up all around the country. The terrorists directed the two planes into the towers in the middle of the morning rush hour. There was no coincidence at the hour they did it. It was right at the height of the rush hour, right at 9 o'clock. And you say, well, how did this happen? Well, we don't know, but apparently two planes bound from Boston to Los Angeles were hijacked almost simultaneously. Somebody had to go into the cockpit of the plane, somebody had to command the plane, and somebody said, in effect, I'm a suicide bomber, an airborne suicide bomber. And they crashed the planes into the World Trade Center. And much the same thing is believed to have happened with the crash into the Pentagon. Now, as for what happened in western Pennsylvania in the Pittsburgh area with the plane crashing there, the details are sketchy. And yes, we did report that the FBI believed that there had been a plane crashed at or near the Camp David presidential retreat in Maryland, but that has remained a vague, unconfirmed story throughout the day. What you're watching on your screen now, debris and people, yes, humans, coming down from the upper stories of the World Trade Center before those World Trade Center towers collapsed. Some of the World Trade Center's 50,000 workers were seen leaping from windows to their certain death. That included, in one case, according to eyewitnesses, that included a man and a woman holding hands as they leaped from the World Trade Center as the flames engulfed their floors. Some people jumped from as high as the 80th floor. This happened as the planes exploded into fireballs. Unimaginable, these things, but part of today's reality. Now, first reports had at least 600 people undergoing treatment at hospitals. Early reports said 150 of those were in critical condition. At least another 1,500 so-called walking wounded were taken to Liberty State Park in New Jersey for treatment. The mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, says it may take 2 days before a final figure of the dead and injured becomes known. No one would be surprised if it didn't take longer than 2 days. Yes, there was a New York mayoral primary vote scheduled today in New York that was canceled. I don't have to repeat, but will, that the financial markets closed immediately. They'll have a conference call tonight to determine whether the financial markets will open tomorrow. Hospital officials have been preparing for the worst all day, and they've gotten the worst. The Bellevue Hospital medical director, Eric Mannheimer, called this, and I quote him, a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions. Now, speculation, and please mark the word, italicize the word speculation about the attack, rather quickly focused on terrorist fugitive Osama bin Laden, who was last reported in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's Taliban government, the radical fundamentalist Islamic government of Afghanistan, moved quickly in a public relations effort, understandable from their point of view, to say two things. One, that they deplored this. Two, that they had nothing to do with it. And three, this would surprise some people, the Taliban spokesman saying that Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with this. Exclamation point, pause. That's what they said. And again, we want to come back to nothing but speculation so far. And we pointed out before, and we will point out again, that there are high-level intelligence people in this country and around the world who believe the United States have made a mistake by always attributing almost every terrorist act to Osama bin Laden. There's a school of thought that says we've built him up much larger than he is. I'm not subscribing or not subscribing to that point of view, simply pointing out that there is a point of view, a belief that among some, that we've made too much of Osama bin Laden. But it's way too early to make any conclusions about that. It's just simply to note that speculation centers around Osama bin Laden, as it has in almost every other case of terrorism over the last 6 to 8 years. Although it's true that a lot of people in the United States never heard of Osama bin Laden before the explosions at the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa in 1998 and the ensuing cruise missile attacks by the United States directed at targets in Sudan and Afghanistan. Before that, Osama bin Laden, he was known in intelligence circles and certainly known in the Middle East and around Afghanistan, but was not all that well known in the United States. A high-ranking federal law enforcement official has told our Washington Bureau that no one has been ruled out, but our initial feeling is that this is the work of bin Laden. That government official spoke only on the condition of anonymity. Chris Yates, a well-known aviation expert at Jane's in London, said, and I quote, "Only a small handful of terror groups could have pulled off this operation." And he says, and I quote him, "I would name at the top of the list Osama bin Laden." In Afghanistan, a spokesman for the Taliban rulers denied that bin Laden had any role. However, a London-based Arab newspaperman said that followers of bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago that they would carry out what he called, and I quote him, "a huge and unprecedented attack on U.S. interests." For whatever that may or may not be worth. President Bush ordered a full-scale investigation to what he called hunt down the folks who committed this act. That's a direct quote. Now, American Airlines initially said the Trade Center was hit by 2 of its planes, both hijacked, carrying a total of 156 people, but the airline later said that that was unconfirmed, and now we believe that one American Airlines plane hit one of the World Trade Centers, and then a United Airlines plane hit the other World Trade Center, is what the current belief is. Now, CBS News correspondent and 60 Minutes 2 correspondent Carol Marin is downtown and has a report. Karen? Carol?
As I'm making my way toward the Trade Center, along the water line, thousands of people were walking towards me, streaming out, almost not talking, trying to get through on cell phones that didn't work. Some of them crying, all of them looking pretty agonized. All of a sudden, I heard a roar, and I saw one of the towers blow and then collapse and fill the horizon with smoke, and I yelled, "Oh my God!" And I saw from street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run!" And I turned to run, but I fell, and I felt someone scoop me up, tell me to throw my high heels off, and I was running in my stocking feet with him. And finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead, because there was no way you could run fast enough, and there was no way to avoid it. But somehow we escaped the flame, which was immediately followed by a storm of debris. We were breathing, it felt like giant particles of plaster, and there was smoke, so that if you tried to put your hand out in front of you, you couldn't really see it. It was the thickest, most intense particle and smoke I've ever been in. And somewhere along the line, the firefighter handed me off to a New York police officer. The thing that struck me, though, was that I didn't see many wounded people in the street, which led me to believe, at least where I was by the Trade Center, they had never even gotten out of the building. I thought I was going to die. It is as close as I've ever come as a reporter to thinking I was going to die.
Carol Maureen, who was downtown early this morning when this catastrophe hit. I mistakenly said she was down now, which is what I thought, but this was a replay of a videotape interview we did with Carol Maureen earlier in the day. You know, it's impossible not to compare this coordinated air attack, this undeclared act of war, with the attack on Pearl Harbor almost 60 years ago, the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And it's just as clear as can be that December 7th, 1941 will be forever remembered as, in President Franklin Roosevelt's phrase, a day of infamy. But so too will now September 11th, 2001, go down in American history as a day of infamy. At this moment, you may want to recall that Pearl Harbor was a disaster that brought the United States of America together and propelled it to victory. A thought to ponder as we go through this afternoon. Now, around the world, there have been some expressions of solidarity with the United States. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, made an eloquent short talk to that effect earlier in the day. Others among the United States allies in the world of freedom and democracy around the world have expressed similar sentiments. There have been some expressions of celebration. Palestinians on the West Bank some were said to shoot their weapons in the air today in what was said to be a celebration. Now, what we're waiting on right now is a briefing at the U.S. Defense Department. A Pentagon briefing is expected to brief shortly, and as mentioned earlier, a senior official of the FBI is also expected to brief very shortly. Admiral Craig Quigley will be briefing at the Pentagon. Now, if you're saying to yourself, well, where is President Bush? The answer is we don't absolutely know. He was last reported to be at the air base in Nebraska getting a briefing. He had gone there from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana outside Shreveport. He had gone there from being in Florida earlier in the morning. And as we await the beginning of one of these briefings, you're looking at scenes. This is a live picture in Manhattan. Perhaps, well, I think the world's best-known skyline with the Empire State Building off to the mid-left in your screen with that high, well, looks like a stick, little known, that was supposed to be a dirigible landing place high atop the Empire State Building. That's what it was designed to be, but no dirigible was ever able to get in there. And in that place, the Empire State Building, one of the landmarks of our country, recognizable all over the world. This is what the skyline, the New York skyline, looks like today. The World Trade Center's gone, both of them. Yes, devastatingly gone, right to the ground. Both of them crumbled, each after having been hit separately by hijacked American airliners. And we may be able to show you what the New York City skyline looked like before today. You can imagine, you've seen the postcard pictures, if not all of your life, for a long, long time. But both the World Trade Center buildings, which had become, they really had replaced the Empire State Building as the principal landmark of New York City, both of them are gone. The former foreign minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, is in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Minister. I appreciate very much you doing this. Do you think this terrorist attack on the United States is because of its close friendship with Israel?
An attack on the United States. Attack, stop civilization and bring all of us back to the jungle. And I think we have to do whatever we can not to permit another war with terrible consequences to be spread over. May I say that each of us feel today like an American. Our heart is with the families, with the victims. It's full of pain. But we know the United States is a great and a strong country, and as we've won so many wars and suffered so many agonies, again, you and us and all of us will emerge stronger and more hopeful. I want to say that we have to draw consequences, all of us. We have had, or we are having armies against enemies that practically do not exist, but we have dangers without strategies and without armies. The most important consequence today is to develop a strategy against terror. It can happen every place, everywhere, and cause untold of damage and victims and blood and tears. And the time came for all of us to get ourselves organized. By the way, we send our own rescue team, which is already on the way to the United States. We shall do whatever we can to stand on the United States, which is leading the world, defending democracy, and enabling all of us to remain as a civilized community.
Shimon Peres, you know our country, my country, well. And you know that there are any number of people in the United States who believe these bombings today are a direct result of U.S. support for Israel over the years in the Middle East. To those people who say that, what say you?
Well, you know,